Hi, welcome to part 2 of Introduction to Drupal VM. In part 1, we went through installing dependencies, setting up your host machine, configuring Drupal VM, and creating the VM, giving us a local Drupal 8 development environment. In this part, I'm going to show you how to use Drupal VM to allow for multiple sites. A lot of times in projects, I find I set up more than one site, and I don't want to work with every site within this project having to be its own virtual machine. So we're going to walk through how we can tweak the config.yaml file so that we can set up more than one site on our vhost or our virtual machine. So to do this, we need to add a sync folder that's going to hold our document code. We need to add a vhost to our web server so that we can serve the site. And then we need to add a database that's going to house our Drupal installation. So let's take a look at config.yaml. So we need to find the relevant locations for each one. So the first thing we're going to do is set up another sync folder. Essentially, we can use the exact same parameters here, just specifying the new names for the site that we want to set up. So we specify our local location. Let's just call this site 2. Destination is the folder on the virtual machine that it's going to sync to. So I'm going to put that in var www. We can use the same type, which is NFS. And we want to create it if it's not there. Great. Now we can go down and we can set up our Apache vhosts. So again, we can essentially just copy the same format as what we have in our initial install. I'm just going to call this site2.dev. Rather than using variables in the config file, we can just specify these values directly. And we'll install Drupal with Git for this site, so the document will actually be in a Drupal subfolder within that folder. Forgot the quote there. So this extra parameters value is new to Drupal VM as of, I believe, version 2.2.0, which uses PHP FPM by default over mod PHP. We won't go into the specifics of that, but you essentially just have to make sure that you copy this line here and update this 2.2 to your folder, or else your vhost within Apache is not going to work. Okay, so we've got that set up. And I like to, even though I use Apache, I always like to configure my config file so that it sets up the Nginx host as well. That way, if I ever wanted to switch my machine to use Nginx as opposed to Apache, all I would need to do is change the variable within this file that specifies the web server, and all of my hosts would be set up. I wouldn't have to go in here and remember to re-add all of my hosts to the Nginx section here. Since I'm already adding them in, I might as well take the time and set this up, and it'll save me a headache in the future. So for this, we need to specify the server name, the root, and is PHP. All right, so now we've set up our vhost. Let's just double check. I knew I did that. We actually called this site2, so let me just fix this real quick before we run into errors running it. I know I set site 2 there. And now we need to add a database. And again, we can just use the same format as the original. And we don't need to specify a new user. We can just use the same user that currently exists. And so let's double check our sync folder. We've got our sync folder set up correctly. We've got our vhost set up correctly, although we need quotes here. And we need an ending quote here. It's important that you don't have any typos and you have all your quotes in place, or else the Ansible script will throw errors when you try to run it. So that's why I like to double check everything before I run it. Looks like we've got everything set correctly here. Let's just throw quotes there too. All right. The last little change I like to make here is I like to open port 3306. That's your default MySQL port. I don't usually like to use the web interface that Drupal VM provides. I usually like to run MySQL Administrator or MySQL Workbench from my host computer. And in order to connect those applications to the database within the VM, you need this port opened. So adding 3306 to the allowed firewall ports in the config file here will open that port up and allow for that connection. So let's save our config file. And now, so two things need to happen. We need to reload our virtual machine because Vagrant is what creates the sync folders. So Vagrant needs to rerun, see that those sync folders have been added, and then it will create those folders. And then we need to reprovision our server, which means rerunning our Ansible scripts so that it updates the vhost files on the server as well as creates the database. So we're going to halt our machine here with a vagrant halt command. You could also just run vagrant reload, which will essentially do what we're doing within one command. But I'm just going to halt it there. I'm going to bring it up, and I'm going to pass the -- provision parameter. That's going to say bring up the virtual machine and then rerun the Ansible scripts. So let's run that. So you'll see your Drupal VM output here. It's starting up the virtual machine. We may have to put our administrative password in here for NFS. And then once that boots up, it's going to start rerunning the Ansible script. Let's just give it a second here. There we go. All right. Now it's setting up, it's going to go through and run our Ansible scripts. This is going to be much quicker than the initial load. We've already provisioned our server. It's already downloaded most of the applications that it needs. Ansible's smart enough to know that you've already installed these things, and it won't reinstall it. So this is always going to be much quicker. The only thing that this is going to do is see any changes to the config file. It's going to check to see if that change is already on the server. If it's not, it's going to make that change. So the only thing it's going to do here is add our vhost and create our database. So you can see all of this is running much quicker. All right, so our provisioning has run, and let's walk through it to make sure that everything has been updated. So let's take a look at our host machine in our sites folder. We need to ensure that it created the site2 folder. We can see that alongside our Drupal VM, which is our initial site here, we also have a site2 folder. It's blank because we haven't installed anything in it, but it's been created. I also like to SSH into the machine and ensure that the files were also created on the virtual host. So SSH. So if we go to the www folder, I can see that my site2 is there. All right, so let's walk through just installing, say, a Drupal 7 site here. So let's go into site2. On Drupal.org, you can find in the documentation how you can clone Git in Drupal 7 by using Git. So we're just going to copy this code here, say clone. That's going to check out your Drupal core code here. This might take a second here. So all right, so now that's done. You see that you've got a Drupal folder here, and within that contains our Drupal core code. I just want to note also too that if I'm going to run a Drush site install, I usually do it by SSHing into the Vagrant machine. I've had issues with using the Drupal alias, specifically with the site install command. Any other Drush commands I've been able to run through my host without any issues, but if initially just setting up a site, I usually like to just SSH into the machine to do it. So let's set up a site here with Drush site install, just to see that we have it working here. So let's specify our database that we specified. In the config, site2, site name, 2. I always like to set it as admin. So let's run that. And while that's running through the site install, let's just double check here that our port's open. So I like to open or use the MySQL administrator from my local host or from my host machine to connect to the database within the virtual machine. So to do so, I specify port 3306, which is the default, my username root, password root, connect. Okay, well that didn't work. We're going to have to troubleshoot that in a bit, but this is saying our installation is complete. So let's check to see that we have this working. Oh, actually, the next thing that we have to do is actually add the entry in our host file, or else it's not going to work from our host machine. So let's do that quickly. Add a line in here. So if we go to Site 2 here, we'll see that we have our Drupal 7 installation up and running. Great, so now we've walked through our initial Drupal 8 setup with running with the default config file, and we've run through how we can set up a second site within the VM. Within the same process, you can set up as many sites as you want, just adding different sync folders and adding new Apache vhosts as well as the database. So you can really set up any number of sites that you need within the same VM.